all its detestable things and all its abominations. And I will give them one heart and a new spirit. I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh.
All right. So, there at the end of chapter 11, if you remember, 11 was a lot of words of judgment and things like that. But at the end there, right, we get this beautiful promise that God is eventually, after that punishment comes upon them in the siege of Jerusalem and the exile, he's going to restore them, and he's going to give them a new heart, right? This is, we say, create in me a clean heart, O God, right? It's kind of the same language. That we know that our hearts can grow cold and hard and stony, and God is saying that's what's really happened to the Israelites, right? So then he asks or he promises that he will solve that issue by giving us new hearts that instead of being rebellious against God and even hating his ways, instead we love his ways. All right, turn to Ezekiel 16, and then we will have a word of prayer here. We get started and figure out what I just did with mine. What did I do with that sheet? There it is. All right. Let's have a word of prayer. Dear Lord God, we come to you this day. We're thankful to have this time to be in your house and even now to study your word, God. We pray that as we hear these harsh words of judgment today from God, that we would ourselves be ashamed of our sinful deeds and turn back to you, O God, in confession and receive anew your forgiveness, your strength, and those new hearts you have promised. We ask this in Christ's holy name. Amen. All right. So you see at the top, right? This is sort of our dive into chapters 24 or 12 to 24, but we're really just going to look at one chapter. And in this section, there's words of just prophecy of destruction again. But then probably the unique feature of this section is that there are these little parables that talk about Israel, that talk about how God views Israel at this point, again, in the history of his interaction with his people, leading up to the exile, the siege of Jerusalem, all of those things. I should say a couple things here when we start chapter 16. As I got about to the end of putting this together, I read something that said that the Jewish rabbis in the Mishnah, which is kind of their editorial comments on the Old Testament, said this text should never be read or translated among the congregation. Okay? You'll see why in a second. This text is very explicit, and there'll be things probably in your English translation that you'll say, wow, that's something, right? And I guarantee you, if you read the Hebrew, it's much worse. I mean, as far as just how things are stated here. The overall image, right, is this idea that Israel is going to be God's wife, right? But that wife is going to turn herself into a prostitute, and again, the language here, I hesitated even here. Whore has such a biting nature in our language, but that's the kind of words that Ezekiel's using. He's using very biting words in this section, or I should say God is using very biting words in this section to point out how bad the rebellion of Israel has been. Yeah, Nancy.
The women's Bible study.
Yeah.
I've been studying Hosea.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing there. And Betty even has a Bible called The Message.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Oh my.
It is very explicit.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right. Yeah. And, and this is always the thing, we always have to remember, even with translations of the Bible, we sometimes talk about different things that go into translation, but this is one we don't talk about often, is when translators come upon something in the Bible that, quite frankly, they think are going to offend most of their readers, right? And then they say, well, do we leave it as what it is, or do we tap it down a little, right? And again, not trying to be unfaithful, not trying to change it. I always would describe it as this, right? Like the difference of how you might talk to your spouse about something, right? And if you had to talk about that same topic to your younger children, you're not going to try to lie, but you're certainly not going to describe things quite as vividly, right? Again, some of how we describe things depends on what we assume the experience of others is, right? Whether, again, to talk to two soldiers to talk to each other about the gruesome events of war is a different thing, right? Than to just come home from war and talk to some little kid about everything you saw in war and what happened, right? You again, you'd still talk the truth. You'd say, we got in a battle, right? There was a great battle. Maybe you'd even say, that soldier died, but you're not likely to describe the exact manner of death and things like that, right? And I think that's what the translators do a little bit for us here. So yeah, they say, and again, I'll take comfort. I'm not doing this in the General Assembly at church, just here with you guys who are ready to handle it. I told my kids and Josh, who's visiting, to put on their adult ears today for this. So. Sometimes my kids will ask me, "What are we covering today?" This time I was like, I don't know if I want to describe it quickly. All right. Throughout this whole section, we should say that there are sort of these three basic groups mentioned. I mean, there's a couple others, the enemies of God, like Egypt and Babylon and Assyria and the Philistines. But the three basic players, and we'll get to these kind of near the end again, is there's Jerusalem, and that's sort of the word that's used for all of Judah, for the southern tribe or tribes. Oh, I put that wrong. I was supposed to put that on the top one there. You see where I put tribes. I added that, but I added it to the wrong one. So Samaria is definitely tribes because there's 10 of those. That's Israel, that northern kingdom. And the southern kingdom we've talked about, whether you say it's just one tribe. Generally, the Bible talks about just Judah. But especially when it's originally divided up, we get this idea that it's Benjamin and Judah together. But either, right, so I meant to put that apostrophe S up on the top one. And then we get Sodom is brought up. Of course, by this point, Ezekiel is talking. Sodom has been destroyed for a very long time, right? This is not a recent occurrence. And yet Sodom is one of the things in the Bible that gets brought up over and over again as sort of a personification of evil, of depravity. Babylon will be the same way at times. Egypt, these real places at real times are so bad that they sort of become just kind of a picture of everything that is bad. And when we look at that, I guess we want to say here it's interesting that Sodom is going to be brought up mostly in this section, actually to show how bad Israel is, not to show how bad Sodom is. But Israel's going to be told, you're worse than Sodom. Yeah. Just real quick, what happened to Sodom, anybody?
It was destroyed.
Fire and sulfur destroyed, right? So again, if you're being told you're worse than Sodom, those are heavy words to bear. Okay, that's a little bit later. Then I put here just the basic concept here is we're going to see God marry Israel. They're going to be completely faithless. Again, the wife turned whore here kind of language. Then there will be consequences, and yet we'll get this hopeful word at the end that God says he's not done. He's going to remain faithful to his covenant. He's going to make a new covenant. Kind of talks in both languages there at the end. And the last thing we want to say is some people, when they're studying this part with everything that's said in the parable, will try to say, when's that? Is this talking about when Israel was in Egypt? Is this talking about this? I'll reference those things occasionally of kind of what they might be. But overall, we want to say this is a parable. That's not what it's intended to be, right? What you should come away from this ultimately, after all the details, is the big picture of this absolute unfaithfulness of Israel, God's punishment upon that, and then his promise to restore. Okay, so we don't need to figure out exactly what everything is. And probably as we get into these first 5 verses, this is one of those places that this will kind of be clear, where you say, well, when is this whole thing where Israel is born and yet it's kind of abandoned? Like, when does that happen? And it's really a hard question to answer, okay? But if you get the point of it, it's a very clear point that God makes other places about Israel. So let's read those first 5 verses now. If somebody would, Ezekiel 16, 1 through 5.
The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, confront Jerusalem with her detestable practices and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says to Jerusalem. Your ancestry and birth were in the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. On the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths. No one looked on you with pity or had compassion enough to do any of these things for you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field, for on the day you were born, you were despised.
Oh, it's going to get worse. So we start off with this, again, this picture of a child being born. First, God throws the first insult at them, which is he basically calls the Israelites Canaanites. Right? And that's like, I don't know, it's like telling someone from Colby, you're from Goodland.
They're talking about something.
Sorry. But this really is kind of the idea here is the Canaanites were evil, right? They were the ones that had to be kicked out of the land, and not just so Israel could get there, but because they deserved also to be driven out of the land because of the abominations they do, which is a word we get throughout this section, right? It really throughout the book of Ezekiel, that what Israel is doing is an abomination. Well, the Canaanites were their whole way was abomination, and so now here, and this is one of those places. Well, what are we talking about here? When he says that your mom and dad were a Hittite and an Amorite, which were kind of generally speaking, the two most powerful groups among the Canaanites, at least at most times. So one, we might say, and this one is for sure, that he's saying, spiritually speaking, you're a chip off their block, right? You're acting like the Canaanites. Again, this is, if there's a kid who's sort of wild and their father is also known to be wild, you're just like, oh yeah, he's a insert last name here, right? And there's just kind of this assumption. So that's kind of the picture. I did read one interesting thing here that says a lot of places, just in literature in general, the dad will be spoken of poorly, right? But usually the mother then is kind of the tender, good one in the story. Like, well, so yeah, he's kind of like his dad, but don't forget he also had a mom. She's okay, at least, But here, both of them, right? Mom and dad are both Canaanites. They're both godless people practicing abominations. So spiritually, that's true. And to some extent, at a certain point at least, particularly as they get back into the promised land, we're also going to have the truth that they're intermarrying with these godless nations, which they're not supposed to do, right? They're intermarrying with them, and in that case, they are, even in their blood, there is Canaanite blood in their blood, which again would have been a very offensive thing to say to the Jews, even though it was true, right? It kind of like saying to an absolute white supremacist that, you have these other, bloods running through your body. And they say, no, I'm pure, right? I'm pure. This is what the Jews wanted to be, was pure in their lineage to Abraham. And that wasn't even true, right? Because of their unfaithfulness that they had practiced, particularly in the Promised Land. And we see that throughout this intermarriage. where you get to the point where you have, prophets that are telling people they have to break those marriages off. It's a hard section to understand in the Bible, but he calls to send them away because it's such an abominable practice. Okay. Okay. Then he describes them. Not only are they of bad genes or whatever you want to say here, but they're also then being treated like an abandoned child. I think I put this at the end, but again, like Plato, right? Who I don't know if any of you have ever read Plato, or parts of him, had a class where you had to, anything like that. But he was considered, right, one of the great Greek philosophers of the world. But he himself would suggest that if you had a child that you did not want or was born into the world deformed, this is what you should do. You should take that child. You should not do anything to it that was carrying it all, and you should go cast it out in the field. And if you cast it out in the field, what's going to happen next? It's going to die, and then what? Animals are going to eat it, right? That was the suggested practice, right? We don't have much time to talk about this, right? We've come up with our own way of abandoning children that are unwanted, right? It's called abortion. The only deal is we do it in a way that appears to be much more sanitary, sterile, right? And yet, in the end, it's just as grave of an evil, right? Of course, I always say when we're talking about this, it's an evil that can be forgiven, right? Because we know that with the amount of abortions in America, the truth is that generally they will say if you're speaking to any room, there's somebody in it, and again, I'm not saying that, don't start looking around at your neighbors here, but there's somebody that's been very closely involved in an abortion, right? Either had an abortion, told someone else to get an abortion, maybe a parent of a child that had an abortion, that this is very common. I just say this not only to do this here, but for you to remember too. When you're speaking to people about that issue, you always want to remember that you may be talking to someone that doesn't just view this issue as a political argument. They view it as a very personal thing that they may have had a role in of some sort. Now, again, in the end, that doesn't change the content of what we say at all, right? But it might change the manner in which we address it. And it certainly means that we need to put the gospel forth. That even if you have been directly involved in this, right, there is forgiveness in this, or for this in Christ. Okay? 4 things we're told were not done. They didn't cut the umbilical cord right away. I don't know. We don't have Brian here today, although I know he doesn't really like to be involved in the birth stuff anyway. So maybe he read ahead. And I don't know that, a lot of stuff I read said that, there's only a certain amount of time that you can leave that umbilical cord connected before real trouble comes. I had never really thought of that. I mean, I always notice, birth, they're pretty quick about, get over here with the scissors, do that, Dad, right? But I guess I never really thought, like, is there a immediate danger there of how long after you come out of the body you could still be connected there?
It's
but
a while. It's
not right away. Okay. But it is something that has to be done. And obviously it's just part of the child has been born, if nothing else, right? It's just, we need to move them from that life they had in the womb to this life they're now going to have outside of the womb. So that wasn't done. They weren't cleaned up, right? And something I read said these first 2 are very common to us, right? They're kind of ritualistic even in how we think about them when the baby comes out. Again, it's not always now the dad, but that used to always be, the dad would clip the umbilical cord if he was in there. I should say always, right? Go back another generation, the dads weren't even there, right? But when dads have been there, that's kind of been their thing, at least in my experience. And then, somebody's got to give the baby the first bath, right? So that's not done here either. Then they would rub the baby with salt, and we're not sure exactly what this is, but the thought is that it's sort of just right? I mean, still today, if you go to like the ladies store, right, you can buy salt to rub on your skin to exfoliate your skin, which they'll charge you like 20 times what regular salt costs, right? So this is my suggestion to you: get rid of those fancy things. Just put a little olive oil and salt together. This is not intended as medical advice.
It's interesting too, that practice was practiced by the Palestinians until 1918.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay. That rubbing with salt.
Uh-huh.
And some people say too, they might have like also kind of put this in the swaddling clothes or cloths, whichever one you want to use there, that they kind of wrap them up in there, and they thought it was sort of antibacterial in there. The other thing I learned, which I didn't really know, is that the swaddling clothes to a lot of cultures is not just like, oh, wrap them up, they're a cute little baby, but they actually believed it sort of caused you to be formed straight instead of being crooked, And in some cultures, they'll put a board in the swaddling clothes to make sure you grow up proper. But, so none of those things are done. Let's see, I didn't give the fourth one, did I? Oh, yeah, wrapped in swaddling clothes. And then again, like I said, cast out on the ground. So this basically, it's a horrific picture, but what you have here is this child again that is just cast away, still covered in its, all that stuff of birth, right? The blood, the water, the fluid, covered in that, thrown out in the field. This is how God finds Israel. Right? And again, when exactly did this happen? I don't think it's worth even trying to give an answer. As far as when we're talking about the covenant made, there we can say a little bit more Mount Sinai, the giving of the 10 Commandments. That's the language of covenant to there. But this first part, this is just the same as, God saying in another place, Israel, I didn't choose you because there was something about you. I didn't choose you because you were the most numerous nation on earth, right? I chose you completely out of love, completely by grace. No, as we would say in our catechism, no merit or worthiness within you at all, right? Just by grace. I chose to love you. And really, I chose to love you because you were in such a mess of a situation, right? Praise be to God. That's still true. That's how we're all here, part of God's family, right? Is that he welcomes messes like us as well. All right, let's go on to 6 and 7.
Then I passed by and saw you kicking about in your blood, and as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, live. I made you grow. Sorry, I lost my place. I made you grow like a plant of the field. You grew up and developed and became the most beautiful of jewels. Your breasts were formed and your hair grew, and you were naked and bare.
All right, that's if you don't like to get read real easily, read over that stuff quick, right? What's being observed there. But the basic point is God sees this abandoned child and he adopts it, right? And again, even in the ancient world, this was true. If you got to the field and these children were thrown out into the field, you could, if they were still alive, you could grab them and take them as your own. And generally that would be recognized as a proper adoption. We know that Christians in the early church did exactly this because they thought this practice was so horrific that they actually went out and would try to find these kids that had been abandoned and raise them, right? This is why we have orphanages early in the early church and things like that, is because they thought this was so horrific that they needed to take action there. But so he says, in your blood, live. Right? You're not going to die. You're going to live. And then we get this quick picture of this girl, right? This baby girl that was there growing up into puberty, right? And kind of the idea is when she gets to puberty, no one would have ever known, right? That of her being cast into a field at her birth. They would have never known, right? Because now not only is she healthy, alive, she's beautiful, right? This is going to be an overall picture here. And this is, again, saying as Israel grows up, right, people are going to start thinking of Israel differently, especially now when we get into the Promised Land, particularly when we get into the periods of David and Solomon. But even, right, remember when they're coming into the Promised Land, everybody's kind of afraid of them, right, because they hear the stories of towns falling everywhere. And so people start to think very highly of Israel. And again, through especially David and part of Solomon's reign, at least, this only grows, right? So that like the Queen of Sheba, right, is coming to see the king of Israel and all their stuff. They think of Israel as beautiful. They think of it as the place to go if you want to see a nation that's really got it, going on, right? And that's the picture here of this girl reaching puberty, though she is pictured here as naked, right? And there's this whole image throughout this chapter of is Israel naked or are they clothed? Right? This is when they're going on their own, they become naked and ashamed. When they're with God, He covers them. All right, let's go on to 8 through 14. I'm sorry, I'm kind of rolling on this, but this is the longest chapter in Ezekiel, and if we're going to come close, we keep reading. We may have to take 2 on this one. Sorry, 8 through 14, if I can say.
Later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. I bathed you with water and washed the blood from you and put ointments on you. I clothed you with an embroidered dress and put leather sandals on you. I dressed you in fine linen and covered you with costly garments. I adorned you with jewelry. I put bracelets on your arms and a necklace around your neck. And I put a ring on your nose, earrings on your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. So you were adorned with gold and silver. Your clothes were of fine linen and costly fabric and embroidered cloth. Your food was fine flour, honey, and olive oil. You became very beautiful and rose to be a queen. And your fame spread among the nations on account of your beauty, because the splendor I had given you made your beauty perfect, declares the sovereign Lord.
All right. This is the beautiful part of this chapter, right? That God says, right, when I found you again, at the age of puberty, ready for marriage, all of these kind of things. Then the image is that He marries her. And part of the image is this, He spreads the corner of His garment over her, covering her nakedness is sort of the idea here. You might remember Ruth and Boaz, right? When Ruth comes back and lays at the feet of Boaz, uncovers his feet. Again, people that are really want something to be there will try to claim this is all sort of really lurid kind of stuff, but really this was a ritual, right, that related to betrothal and marriage. Is this idea, and again, this is just, we don't talk about this real often, but again, part of the marriage bond, right, is that nakedness now belongs to the other person, right? The body becomes that other person's possession, both ways, right? Man to wife, wife to man. And so again, to the world now, the nakedness is covered up. That's not for anybody else's eyes, right? That's kind of the idea. And that only then husband and wife will be that intimate with one another. Okay? So that's part of the image here of Him covering the garment. This could either, like I said, be kind of betrothal. Of course, with Boaz, this happens, or she asks him actually to cover her nakedness. And then he says, well, I've got to go out to the city gate and talk to the elders, and then we can do this. Side note, but marriage is a public deal, right? Ultimately, while it's a very intimate, private matter, it's also a public deal that you're saying before the world, we're together, right? This is us, treat us as such, and encourage us as such, and everything else that goes along there. But then after this, we get this image, which is sort of, right, the bride getting ready for the wedding kind of stuff, right? Dressed in the best clothes they can afford, the best jewelry they can afford, bathed and cleaned up, anointed with oil, right? Which, again, I was joking about the facial products and things like that, right? But in the ancient world, olive oil was sort of the main skincare product, right? You put olive oil on your body for lots of purposes, but one of them was to kind of care for your skin. as well. And again, that's still over in the Middle East. That's fairly common today, I'm told. That people still use olive oil a lot in that way. But anyways, here, notice two things. One, there's a particular detail we want to pick out. I think in your translation, Relda, when you read it, said clothed in expensive clothes or expensive materials, or I should have written down
Fine linen and costly garments.
costly garments, right? If you have the King James here, it'll read badger skin. Okay. And now almost everybody agrees it wasn't really badger skin, mostly because the one thing we know about this is that, one, again, it was costly to use, but it was also used as the covering over the tabernacle in the Old Testament. It was covered in well, again, King James will say badger skin there. But again, just straight knowledge, if you're going to cover a huge tent, you want to use badger pelts? Takes a lot of them, right? At least you're gonna have to do some sewing, that's for sure. Binding together. So most people think this is something else. People will argue whether it's leather, whether it's, some people say porpoise skin, but whatever it was valued highly, right? It was not cheap stuff. It was the good shingles for the roof, right? Not tell me what the cheapest ones you can put on are, right? But this is the material that's used on her. So the same material that's used as the covering for God's holy house in the Old Testament is now placed upon Israel. Okay? Kind of a cool picture. The other thing we got to know here is, as New Testament Christians, this language, right, of being bathed, of being, get the whole list here, bathed, cleaned up, anointed with oil, clothed and adorned, that's the language of baptism, right? Both in the New Testament and throughout the church's history, that's what happens in baptism. You're bathed, you're cleaned up. In the early church, again, we don't do this as much, but we know in the early church, when you were baptized, you were always anointed with oil as well. Again, if we wanted to do this, right, when we say, I make the sign of the cross upon you, both upon the forehead and the heart, it would be as simple as dipping a finger in olive oil for that point. But it was this idea that in the Bible, to be anointed in any way with oil is to be set apart. And so that's part of what we have here with this baptismal language. Okay? So we have the Old Testament kind of component. This is the covering of the temple, is now the covering of Israel. For us, we read it and go, in the new covenant, right? We too are a mess. We're covered in our own junk, and God has to come and clean us up, right? He has to clothe us. He has to put us in garments, right? Again, the early church, you were often baptized. You would go in naked, right, to the water, and then you would come forth and you'd be given a white garment to wear. So this imagery is kind of all over the scriptures. All right, let's go on to the net. Unless there's, if you really have a question, raise your hand, because I mean, we can slow down. I'm not against that, but otherwise I'm gonna do that. And then let's see, you read the part about the food also, right? Fed with the fine wheat and oil. Yeah. So this is the other thing, right? Then it's not only is there kind of this image of clothing, but then there's this vision of provision, of feeding his wife, right? And what does he feed her with? Yeah, doesn't sound too bad, right? I mean, again, I suppose if we were talking today, we would say, I don't know, steaks and caviar. And does anyone really want to eat caviar? Except people trying to prove they can eat caviar? Is it rich enough or something? I don't know. I've tried it, but I prefer just salt. That's what it tasted like to me, anyways. Huh? Yeah, I had a weird college roommate who would order off eBay, of all places, caviar, and then he'd bring it to us to try. Anyways, but here we go again. If we look at these materials, fine flour, honey and oil, except honey. Honey's the off one there. You didn't use that in sacrifices, but particularly the fine flour and the oil, those were central to kind of the grain offerings that were offered up in the temple. So again, the very kind of thing that's being used in the holy presence of God, again, is said, this is what Israel is fed with. So it draws together always the holiness of God and his dwelling with God's people. They're being brought together. And of course, we would say here, when we hear of being, fed with good food and being nourished in the church, we say, the Lord's Supper, right? Here's a beautiful picture again. Just like the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, now we have this sacrament of grace in the New Testament where God feeds us with good food, not even just the material food, but the body and blood of Christ as well. And put here now, so this is right. Israel's all dolled up, being fed the best foods, and basically we're told now is renowned, right? So this is, I thought of it kind of like, well, I guess we're going to get this in the next passage too, but we'll be told she's like royalty. Oh no, that was here too, sorry. That she's royalty. And, this is kind of like maybe in our relative context, Princess Diana, right? If you think of how she was sort of thought about, right, as royal, who was beautiful and nice, right? This is how Israel is thought of among the nations. Again, probably if we do want to put a time, again, maybe around the time of Solomon, this is probably when Israel's fame was sort of the greatest among the other nations and things like that. So God's given all these gifts, right? Made her beautiful, so beautiful that other people note her beauty. That's where we get, and that's what God has done in his grace. What's the response? What does Israel do? 15 through 19.
But you trusted in your beauty and used your fame to become a prostitute. You lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. You took some of your garments to make gaudy high places where you carried on your prostitution. Such things should not happen, nor should they ever occur. How far?
Through 19?
You also took the fine jewelry I gave you, the jewelry made of my gold and silver, and you made for yourself male idols and engaged in prostitution with them. And you took your embroidery clothes to put on them, and you offered my oil and incense before them. Also the food I provided for you, the fine flour, olive oil, and honey, I gave you to eat. You offered as fragrant incense before them. That is what happened, declares the sovereign Lord.
All right. Here is God with humanity, right? He blesses, he gives good gifts, he makes one beautiful. And then the person says, things are good, right? I'm in a good place. And what do they typically do then? Begin to trust in themselves, trust in their abilities, their powers, their whatever you want to say, right? They trust in all those things. And then often we take the very gifts of God and we turn them into evil things, right? And there's all these pictures here, right? She takes some of the garments she's been given to wear and she turns those into her brothel, right? She uses them in her brothel where everyone can come to her. She takes the jewelry that God gives her and makes it into male idols. This is one of those places where people will argue in the original Hebrew whether this means just male goddesses like Baal or whether we're actually talking about symbols of the male member, okay, that are being fashioned and used as an idol, kind of a phallic symbol, if you know that word. We know that certainly occurred in ancient history, that, maleness became an idol, and it was often, visualized in the male member, the male sexual member. But it's just awful here, right? She takes everything that's good that God's given her, and now she puts it to work for evil. And again, the New Testament, we get words like this where Paul says, right, your body is not your own. You were bought with a price. So don't then offer up the members of your body to evil, but rather offer your whole self as a living sacrifice to God. Similar language here that we can say, well, okay, I'm really strong or I'm really smart. Okay, maybe that's true. Ask some other people too. But do we put that then to use for God and his kingdom? Or are we putting it to use in evil ways, right? Someone that's really smart can be of great use to a lot of people, or they can find out ways to, work the system and gain wealth from themselves in unethical ways. It's the same smarts that would enable you to do either. right? But it's which one are we going to offer those gifts to? And here, there's definitely an image too, right? She's at the very beginning. Remember, God passes by and he sees this baby in the field. Right? Now we're told every man that passes by, she offers herself to. The exact opposite of marriage, right? Again, that one person with one person, intimate union, she's doing the exact opposite, right? There's no standard for even who would be offered her. I forget what the words were in one of your translations. Her favors, I think, is one of the words it used. She offers this to everybody. And again, what does this mean in the history of Israel? Well, she's making intimate connections with all of these pagan nations. Right? I mean, there's no doubt there might also be just literal sexual sin everywhere. Right? That might be part of why this image is. But again, remember throughout the Bible, adultery and idolatry go together, right? So if you're talking about idolatry, it's often described as adultery. Right? And of course, adultery would also be idolatry because you're worshiping something other than God. But particularly that first way, that often when God talks about someone going off after other idols, he doesn't just say, hey, you're going off in a room and you're standing in front of a carved image and you're saying prayers. He says, you're my wife and you ran off and you slept with that other god. Okay? That's the language here. That's how he thinks about idolatry. It's a very personal matter to him. This is why the word jealousy is used again in these contexts. Not jealous here in a bad sense of I'm a jealous person, just whatever, but a proper jealousy that a husband has for a wife and a wife for a husband. Right? We are one. Right? She belongs to me and I to her. That's how it should be. And if somebody else is trying to get involved with that, then it's proper to be jealous. It's always one question I ask people coming in to get married is, do you want your husband or your wife ever to be jealous about you? And especially the young kids, they'll say, oh, no, we're independent. We, do our own thing. And I'm like, so you're saying like, if you were off flirting with another guy, that shouldn't bother your husband at all? Well, yeah, I would want him to be a little worked up about that. Well, that's jealousy, right? That's jealousy in a proper way. That, you're jealous of what is your own, right? What is given to you. And again, in marriage, both ways, not just husband to wife given, or wife to husband, but both ways it goes. All right. Israel is utterly idolatrous. Well, let's call it quits there. And we'll come back and get the second part of this, which is basically, Israel's going to get worse and worse with their idolatry, worse and worse with using the gifts of God in horrific ways. And God eventually is going to tell them what the punishment is. That's a rather long section. And then we'll get a little word again of grace. It's almost just a hint here. He says, this will happen when I make atonement for her. He just moves on. He doesn't say what that is, what even he's talking about exactly when, but he just mentions it. There's a coming atonement for all of this. And again, those of us that know of Christ, his atonement, right? We say, we got it. We know the hint, right? But this language it's harsh and it's real. And it's real because the sin is really, really bad, right? And the punishment is really, really forceful, right? By God, because of the gravity of the sin. All right, so we'll start, chapter 20 again next time. I probably should mark that on my sheet if I can find a pen. I'll find one quick. All right, let's close with prayer. Dear Lord God, we do thank and praise you for everything that you give to us. Help us never to turn those gifts into a means for idolatry or for trusting in ourselves, but rather let us simply thank you for all the gifts you give us in Jesus. Be with us now as we go into your house to rejoice in those gifts. We ask this in Christ's holy name.